All right, so let's get started. I'm going to hand things over to our founder and executive director, Nathaniel Stinnett.
Thank you, Danielle. And thank you to all of you who are sharing your evening with us. I'm really excited to talk about Texas. So let me start by sharing my screen here, just so you can make sure you're in the right place. This is a briefing and a fundraiser to support the Environmental Voter Project's work in Texas in 2024. And I don't know if you're anything like me, I always like to have kind of a roadmap for what I'm getting into. And so here's your roadmap. We are going to start with a very quick introduction to the Environmental Voter Project. For those of you who are looking for an in-depth overview of all that we do as a nonprofit, I'm sorry, this is not going to get into that. We're going to touch a little bit on what we do at EVP, but only a little bit. And we'll share some links in the chat as we go through this so that you can learn more. But please understand, I am going to breeze through a lot of this so that we can spend the greatest amount of time on number 2 that you see here. And that is a deep dive into what we have found in our voter file analysis and our predictive models, identifying the huge number of low propensity environmental voters in Texas and the places where they can have a really significant impact this year. And then we will close with a Q&A session with all of you. So if you have questions as we are going along, please feel free to put them in that Q&A folder that you see at the bottom. It's on the bottom for most people. Danielle may answer the question as you put it in there, or she may hold on to it so that she can ask me when we get to the Q&A session. All right, let's go ahead and get started. In a nutshell, what the Environmental Voter Project is a nonpartisan nonprofit that is just laser focused on 2 things. 1, identifying people who care deeply about climate and the environment yet don't vote. And then 2, turning them into better voters. That's it. Those are the 2 things we focus on. We find environmentalists who don't vote, and then we turn them into better voters. Now, what that also means is we don't do a lot of the stuff that many other very, very good environmental organizations do focus their time on. But I think it's important to go over this. For instance, we don't endorse candidates. We don't lobby for particular policies. We don't even, as strange as it might sound, try to convince people to care more about climate change or clean air, or clean water, or other environmental issues. In fact, I think a really good way to think about us at the Environmental Voter Project is we're not even in the mind-changing or opinion-changing business at all. In fact, we're solely in the behavior-changing business. What we try to do is find the people who don't need their minds changed. They don't need their behaviors changed. They care so deeply about climate and environmental issues that this is their number 1 priority. Like, they're with us, yet they're not voting. And so what they need is that purely behavioral intervention. And over the next few minutes, as I quickly go through what we do at EVP, I hope to show to you that this is a really high leverage approach to building the political power of the environmental movement. All right, first, why do we take this weird approach? Why do we at the Environmental Voter Project have such a narrow niche? Well, it gets to what I think is one of the biggest problems that we face in the modern climate and environmental movements. And it's shown by this poll that you see here, but I swear to you, any poll anywhere is going to show you data similar to what you're seeing here. Now, what this happens to be is a poll of the most recent federal election. So this was the 22 midterms. This is a poll of likely voters in battleground states. And they were asked, what's your number 1 most important political priority? Only 4% listed climate or some other environmental issue as their top priority. Now, the good news is That's a bigger number than we would have seen in 2018 or 2014. But the bad news is that is nowhere near where we need it to be if we want to force politicians to lead on climate and environmental issues. And again, I recognize this is one poll of one election, but let's say you were looking at the exit polling data from the last presidential election, 2020. Just so happens they asked a very similar question in that poll as well. They asked people who had just voted in the presidential election, what's your number one priority? Guess how many listed climate and the environment? 4%. Whether you look at a city council race in Boise, Idaho, or president of the United States, or anything in between, the data looks eerily similar to this. And that is far, far too few voters list climate and environmental issues as a top priority. And this is such an important thing for us to focus on for two reasons. One, when so few voters care deeply about climate and the environment, boy, does that make it harder to elect good climate leaders. But two, even when we do elect the so-called right people, even when we do elect climate leaders, we all know it isn't like they can just snap their fingers and get whatever they want done, right? No, even when they do get elected, they still need to pick and choose what to spend their precious political capital on. And I tell you, it ain't going to be the thing that only 4% of voters list as their top priority. It just isn't. And this basic idea that we in the climate movement lack significant electoral power, significant political power, is so important. And it's something that we don't often own up to. This is what we are trying to solve at the Environmental Voter Project. But as I just told you, we take a very unique approach to solving it. We try to find these people who already care about climate and the environment, yet aren't voting, and turn them into better voters. Now, why do we take that weird approach? Well, because it turns out that the reason these numbers are so low, it turns out that the reason so few voters care deeply about climate and the environment is not because too few Americans do. If you widen the aperture, if you step back, and instead of just looking at likely voters, you look at, say, all registered voters or all American adults, wow, it turns out that tens of millions of Americans list climate as a top priority. So why aren't they showing up in polls like this one, polls of likely voters? Well, for one pretty simple reason. Environmentalists are disproportionately awful voters. We in the climate movement spend all of our time worrying about persuasion problems. We spend so much time trying to figure out how are we going to convince more people to care about climate change or more people to care about environmental justice. And that's important. Don't get me wrong, that's very important. But the truth is, we in the climate movement probably have a bigger turnout problem than we do a persuasion problem. And this is why we started the Environmental Voter Project and are so laser focused on getting all of these non-voting environmentalists to the polls. And just to give you a sense of how big this problem is, although I'd like to suggest in a little bit that it's also an enormous opportunity. When we look at the last big federal elections, this is the data that we see. In 2020, the last presidential election, over 8 million already registered voters, they were already registered, who list climate and the environment as their top priority, just didn't show up on election day. They just didn't vote. Over 13 million, I'm sorry, almost 13 million in the 2022 midterms. These are huge, huge numbers. And my guess is many of you, if you're seeing these numbers for the first time, are feeling a little bit of frustration, and I don't blame you. But what I would like to suggest to you is that as frustrating as it is that all these environmentalists aren't voting, it is also a huge opportunity because we live at a moment in time where it's become almost impossible to change people's minds about anything, particularly things having to do with climate. But what all these people here represent are folks who don't need their minds changed. They don't need their opinions changed. These are people who, like, you shake them awake at night and they're going to scream climate change. It's their number one priority. They're just not voting. And that is a solvable problem. These people don't need their opinions changed. They need their behavior changed. And I won't claim that's easy. Of course, it's not easy. But what it is easier. And it is also cheaper. And so this is what we focus on at the Environmental Voter Project. Now, as I said, this is only going to be a very brief introduction to what we do at EVP so I can dive into our Texas data. But very briefly, let me just do one more slide showing you sort of the size of this opportunity, all of these non-voting environmentalists. Then I'll get into how we mobilize them and some of our results, and then we'll dive into Texas data, okay? Remember that last poll that I showed you that said 4% of likely voters in battleground states in 2022 listed climate as their top priority? Well, if you dig a little bit deeper in that poll, see something really extraordinary. This is a question that asked how important climate was when choosing a candidate. And they drilled down not just into specific battleground states, but into likely voters versus unlikely voters. So look at the top here. Look at Nevada. 5% of likely voters in Nevada said, yeah, climate's the most important factor when choosing a candidate. But then look at this next line. 10% of unlikely voters said it was their number one factor. Twice as many. Climate is the number one factor for choosing a candidate among twice as many unlikely voters as it is likely voters in Nevada, a pretty darn important state. Look at Pennsylvania, same story. Among likely voters in midterm elections, but believe me, story's the same in presidentials, even though it's a different population. Only 3% said climate was the top factor when choosing a candidate. 7%, more than double among unlikely voters. This is yet another way of illustrating this big opportunity that we have. That there are millions, literally millions, of these already registered super environmentalists who aren't voting. And as I said, these people don't need us to do all the hard work with them. They don't need to have their minds changed. They need to have their behavior changed. And that's a solvable problem. Very briefly, how we do this at the Environmental Voter Project is a 4-step process. And again, forgive me for it being brief. This is not an intro to EVP webinar. This is a Texas webinar. But the 4-step process is as follows. First, we work with data scientists to build predictive models on voter files. These are the same tools that presidential campaigns and US Senate campaigns are using right now to individually target voters. And very briefly, what these are able to do is assign a score from 0 to 100, a probability score, to every single voter in a state voter file, telling us how likely they are to not just care about climate and the environment, but literally listed as their number one priority over all other issues. And again, you're here for Texas stuff, so forgive me for not going into an enormous amount of detail here, but I will just say 2 more things. One, if you want more information about how these predictive models are built, we do have a YouTube video on this, just on how we identify environmental voters, and it is on our YouTube page. But also, 2, just know that the last step in the process of us building these predictive models is we always then isolate the people who have the highest likelihood of listing climate and the environment as their number one priority. And usually that cutoff is at 85%. So we take the people who have at least an 85% likelihood of listing climate as their number one priority. And we say, thank you very much, data scientists. We appreciate all your hard work. We are now going to give this list of people who have a greater than 85% likelihood of listing climate as their top priority to your competitors. And we are going to ask them to poll those people and ask them just one question. And that is, what's your number one most important political priority? And every time we have done that, at least 85% of the respondents have said, oh, climate change. Why do you ask? That's how accurate these predictive models are. Not because we're particularly good or bad at this, but because that's where this technique is. All right, so we are able to accurately identify these super environmentalists. We then weed out the ones who are good voters and only focus on the ones who need our behavioral intervention. That's step 2, mobilization. We can then be completely agnostic with our messaging. Because remember, we no longer need to convince these people to care about climate. We can now talk about whatever we want. I like to say we could talk about chocolate chip cookies now if that's what it takes these people to vote. And so we run hundreds of randomized control trials testing which messages work best with which low propensity environmental voters to do just one thing and one thing only, and that is get them to the polls. We work with thousands of volunteers to canvass and call and mail these voters. We also send direct mail and digital ads to them. And perhaps most importantly, step 3, we work year-round. Because we know, not just from all this behavioral science that we live each day, but just because it is intuitively obvious that if you're trying to change someone's habits, you can't just breeze in and talk to them once every 2 years when there's a big federal election going on. No, you need to use every election as a precious opportunity to change their behavior. And so that's what we do. Locals, state elections, federal elections, primaries, specials, generals. Just in 2024 alone, just in the last 3 months, we've already been active in 137 different elections. And that's not because all of them were important for environmental policymaking. I freely admit many of them weren't. But they were all crucial if your goal is to change people's voting behavior. Because the simple truth is the only way to turn a non-voter into a voter is to get them to vote in an election. And so our approach is, how dare we let an election pass us by without using it as an opportunity to talk to these voters? Because ultimately, step 4 is our goal, and that is to so dramatically increase the number of environmental voters, not non-voters, but voters, that politicians are forced to follow. Not because out of the goodness of their heart or an appreciation for science, they want to address the climate crisis. No, that ain't going to happen. No, we're building up political power of climate voters because there is one thing and one thing only that politicians care about, and that is winning or losing elections. And I know that sounds cynical, but it's not. It's just the basic arithmetic of democracy. Either you get enough votes or you don't get to be a politician anymore. So our job is to make sure that there are as many climate first voters in every election possible in the 19 states that we work in. All right, if you want more information about the work that we do at the Environmental Voter Project, there will be a link in the chat. Very briefly, these are our results, and then I'm going to get to Texas data. We measure our impact in 2 ways. The first is in specific elections. The way we measure our impact in specific elections is through something called randomized control trials. These are like the gold standard that social scientists use to measure whether you're changing someone's behavior. And very briefly, this is how they work. Let's say we've identified 1 million of these unlikely to vote super environmentalists in, say, Texas. Well, before we talk to a single one of them, we randomly separate those people into 2 groups. One is called a treatment group or an intervention group, and the other a control group. Usually it's about an 85% to 15% split, with the control group having 15% of that initial population. Here's the important thing. We never talk to the people in the control group. Not at all. But the remaining group, the treatment group, they're the ones who we canvass and call and send postcards to and digital ads and direct mail, all with this behavioral science-informed messaging. Then the election happens. Then something really important takes place. About 2 months after the election, public voter files are updated, and you can see how many low propensity environmental voters who we identified in our control group voted, and compare it to how many in our treatment group voted. Because whether you know this or not, it's really important to understand that whether you vote or not is public record. Who you vote for is secret, but whether you vote or not is public record. And so when voter files are updated, we can compare turnout in our control group of low propensity environmental voters to turnout in our treatment group, the people who we actually messaged to. And as long as that initial separation was truly random, and as long as the numbers are big enough, what this allows us to do is isolate what our sole impact was on turnout while controlling for all outside variables. And very briefly, just in the last 4 years, in the 19 states that you'll see there, these are the 19 states that we work in, we probably increased turnout in all 900 or so elections that we were involved in, but probably ain't good enough for us. We want to be able to prove with real statistical rigor that we were solely responsible for increasing turnout. And if we hadn't have been there, then a whole bunch of people would have stayed at home. And obviously, in a lot of these elections that are small, we can't prove that with what's called statistical significance. But in many elections, we can. And in 2020, in 21, in 22, in 23, these randomized control trials showed that the Environmental Voter Project was solely responsible for increasing turnout while controlling for all outside variables, as much as 1.8 percentage points in statewide general elections, as much as 3.6 percentage points in statewide primaries, and as much as 5.7 percentage points in local elections. And these numbers might not seem like a big deal to you, but ask Donald Trump how big a deal 1.8% is in Pennsylvania, and he'll tell you. These are big numbers in this business. Finally, the second way that we measure our impact is over the long term. We launched our proof of concept in Boston in 2015 and 2016, and then we launched for good in 2017. We then expanded slowly but surely to the point where we're now in 19 states. Over that time, we have now spoken to over 9.5 million unique individuals, all of whom we've tagged in our voter files, and we track their voting history. By definition, all of them are super environmentalists who were unlikely to vote, or else we wouldn't have been talking to them, right? Well, as of about 11 months ago, which was the last time we made this measurement, we're about to do it again. We're just waiting for a few more voter files to be updated from last year. But as of the last time we did this, out of those 9.5 million low propensity environment first voters, almost 1.5 million of them had become such consistent voters that we could see on public voter files that they had voted in their most recent federal election, their most recent state election, and even their most recent local election. They had become super voters. You could be running for dog catcher, and you would look at the voter file and you'd say, oh, yep, that person's going to vote. Got to go knock on their door, talk to them, figure out what issues they care about. This is the metric of which we are most proud. Now, I do want to be clear, this is different from the previous metric. This is not a randomized control trial. I can't claim that we are solely responsible for turning 1.5 million non-voters into super voters. But we're pretty darn responsible. No other organization has now been active in over 1,900 elections in the last 7 years, doing the little behind the scenes work in dinky little local elections to turn these non-voters into super voters. All right. If you want more information about our results, you can find a whole bunch of studies and reports at environmentalvoter.org/results. That's it. That's all I'm going to say about our work. Now I'm getting into Texas, okay? All right. As part of our research, as I mentioned to you, we build these predictive models. And what that allows us to do is individually identify on voter files people who are registered to vote. They're really, really likely to not just care about climate, but literally listed as their number one priority. Yet, they are unlikely to vote in the next given election. In this particular instance, we're talking about the presidential general election that is now just a little over 7 months away. When we look at our data in Texas, we see enormous opportunities for the climate and environmental movements. First off, we've identified, and I mean that in like the creepiest sense, we literally know them by name and street address, over 710,000 of these registered super environmentalists who are unlikely to vote this fall. And that's after removing that control group that I told you about. These are the people we are targeting. All right, so what does a number like 710,000 mean in Texas? Well, 11.35 million ballots were cast last time there was a presidential election in Texas. And even though Texas wasn't that close, it was only decided by 631,000 votes, so less than this number of people we have already identified on an individualized basis as being registered super environmentalists who are unlikely to vote this fall. Texas is also going to be very important this year. Just on a federal level, and I'll get into discussing some state things in a second, but just on a federal level, it might be important at a presidential level. Unlikely, but possible. It could very well be important for who controls the US Senate. And even though Texas is a very heavily gerrymandered state, both on state legislature and Congress, there are 3 competitive congressional districts. So see there, the 15th, the 28th, and the 34th. As you'll see, Texas has already had a bunch of elections, statewide primaries, some locals, yet it still has many more coming up. Some of these are specials, some of these are runoffs from the primary or runoffs from specials. May 4th, May 28th, June 15th, and obviously the big one, November 5th. This is important to us because remember, everybody at the Apple, every election is an opportunity to talk to these low propensity environmental voters. All right, who are these people? We get into some of the demographics at the bottom here. And I just want to explain what these charts mean. So first, go all the way to the bottom here, the very bottom line here. That is reg voters, registered voters. So what that means is 11.5. That means that 11.5% of registered voters in Texas are between the ages of 18 to 24. 17.9% are 25 to 34. And you can see we've got sex demographic breakdown and race demographic breakdown. That's the baseline. That's what the overall electorate looks like in Texas. The line above that, LPEVs, that stands for low propensity environmental voters. These are these people we're targeting to mobilize to build the political power of the climate movement. Now, to be clear, these low propensity environmental voters are also registered, so they're a subset of that bottom group. But I did want to provide that registered voter baseline so you have some context for this demographic data. The first thing that you'll notice is these low propensity environmental voters in Texas are disproportionately young. Now, that probably doesn't surprise many of you. But as someone who lives this data every day and runs an organization that works in 19 states, let me tell you, it's never as crazy as what we see in Texas. Literally 90.1% of the low propensity environmental voters in Texas are below the age of 35. In other states, it's more like 70%, 75%. In Texas, oh my gosh, is this an overwhelmingly young population? And as you can see, in that 50 to 64-year-old range, the older Gen Xers, almost none of them care deeply about climate and the environment in Texas. And an even smaller number are low propensity environmental voters. So that's one demographic thing that I wanted to point out. The second thing is, whoa, look at this gender gap. Now, to be clear, gender gap is kind of a term of art. What we're actually talking about here is sex data. State and local election authorities, not just in Texas, but elsewhere, don't track gender data. They track sex data. But as you'll see here, among registered voters, there's a 5% gender gap. In other words, women are 5%, there are 5 percentage points more registered women voters than men in Texas. So there's a small gender gap there. When you look at low propensity environmental voters, it blows up to a 15-point gender gap. See, only 42% male, 57% female. So the second thing to take away about this population in Texas is not only are the low propensity environmental voters disproportionately young, like a crazy degree, but two, there's a huge gender gap. So they're disproportionately women. All right. The third thing that I'd like to highlight is these low propensity environmental voters are disproportionately people of color. Now, that is something that we see in all 19 of our states to a greater or lesser degree. As you'll see here in Texas, they're disproportionately Black. Well, they're disproportionately all groups of color, Black, Hispanic, AAPI. The Native American population in Texas is small enough that we can't really see that jump there. The bump in the Hispanic population has been dropping pretty precipitously. When we looked at our data last year or the year before last, it was a much, much bigger spread. That is something I want to point out. So this is what this population looks like. All right, now where are they? Well, you'll see it is largely an urban population. That is something that we see in many of our states, but it is not a completely urban population. Now, obviously, you're not looking at 710,000 different dots, right? This is more of a heat map with dots representing a large number of these low propensity environmental voters. But you'll see, although certainly there's a huge cluster around Austin and San Antonio and Dallas and Houston and Amarillo and other places, there are some clusters in less urban areas. And I think that is important to highlight. Austin is of particular interest for a few reasons. One, oh my God, are there a huge population of registered voters who list climate and the environment as their top priority, yet they are unlikely to vote this fall. And yeah, maybe you're thinking like, well, okay, yeah, that makes sense. It's Austin, like big deal. Well, like people at Austin are Texans too. And when you're voting for president or voting for US Senate, their vote counts just as much as people in another part of the state. And this is a huge, huge block of voters. A huge block of voters. Perhaps even more interestingly, over 35,000 of them are what we call canvassable. That means they aren't in a high rise or they're not in a gated community. You can reach them. You can get to their door and talk to them face to face. And better than that, they're not really far apart from each other, so you can walk from door to door. They are easily canvassable, and there's what we call canvassable density. And this opens up one of the most important tools we have to turn non-voters into voters. Because even with digital ads and direct mail and all these fancy experiments, the simple truth is having a face-to-face conversation with somebody at their door remains the single most effective way to boost turnout. And we, the Environmental Voter Project, work in 19 states. There are probably 60 or 70 very large cities in those states. And of all of those cities and all of those states, we've only chosen 4 to run door-to-door canvassing operations in, simply because those cities have enormous canvassable density. A lot of these targets you can knock on their doors. One is Tucson, Arizona. Another is Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Another is Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And the fourth you're looking at right here is Austin, Texas. And the truth is, Austin's probably the best. And I say that as someone who's from Philadelphia originally. It's the best just because there are so many of these low propensity environmental voters whose doors you can knock on. So that is another important opportunity, an important turnout opportunity for the climate movement in Texas. I also want to point out the 3 close congressional districts or competitive congressional districts in Texas. So what we're looking at, for those of you who aren't really familiar with the geography of Texas, is that like little bit that sneaks down in the southern central portion of the state. Okay, that kind of like reverse panhandle there. We've got in the middle the 15th congressional district. Then over on the side here, and you see that here, over on the side to the west is the 28th congressional district. And then down here, and you'll see a blow up of that over here, is the 34th congressional district. In the 28th over here, we've identified 18,000 of these already registered super environmentalists. Same here in the 15th. And the 34th, we've identified almost 21,000. And again, not to be creepy, but we know who these people are by name and street address. These are the low propensity super environmentalists who we spend all of our time and energy and money and volunteer power going after. Just to give you a sense, these are these districts here. In the 15th, this district is so close that it only has an R+1 partisan lean. What does that mean? It means that looking back over the last 2 midterms and the last 2 presidential elections, this district voted 1 point more Republican than the national average. So it is about as close to being the national average as you can get. That's how close a district this is. Monica De La Cruz, a Republican, is the incumbent. The 28th, that's over here. That's D+3, Henry Cuellar's district. Still very close, 18,000 targets we've identified. The 34th is a little bit safer for Democrats. We've identified 21,000 there. Now, Texas has an absurd number of districts, as you'll see. These are the only close ones. But 3 competitive congressional districts is a hell of a lot more than you'll see in most other states. So this is actually a big opportunity. When we're talking about Texas in 2024, it's not just state legislative races. It's not just the U.S. Senate or president. These 3 seats are going to be really important as well. I'm not going to dive down into a whole bunch of different legislative districts, but what I will say is that this is the breakdown. These are heavily gerrymandered districts. I don't want to imply that either state house is about to flip. It's probably not. There's probably a better chance of the state house than the state Senate flipping, even though it doesn't quite look that way when you look at this. But what I do think is important to understand is that Texas is the single most rapidly urbanizing state in the country. And it is the second fastest growing state in the nation, which means oh my God, do the makeups of each of these districts change dramatically, not just with each passing election cycle, but with each passing month. So who knows what's going to happen over the next 7 months? But what I can tell you is that 2, 4, 6 years from now, especially the next time there's redistricting, it, these districts are going to look completely different than they do now in a way that you really don't see in any other states, just because Texas is growing so quickly. And so it's really, really important to pay attention to this stuff as well, which is another reason why the Environmental Voter Project is going to be active across the entire state of Texas. All right. As we look at the next 7 months, we have a $2 million budget for Texas. Yeah, that's a big number. That's a big number. But we're targeting 710,000 voters. So actually, this is spending less than $3 per voter. We will be canvassing year round in Austin and the areas right outside Austin. We will be running robust volunteer phone campaigns for a whole bunch of local elections and state special elections and runoffs, April through June, and then obviously again September through November. We will be running robust digital ad campaigns, direct mail campaigns, and most likely a volunteer postcarding campaign. I want to be clear. Just since 2020, I think we have run 170 something randomized control trials. We know which messages work. We already know what messages we're going to deliver to these already identified voters. We can dramatically increase their turnout. We just need the money to make it happen. We just need the money to make it happen. And so I'd love to get to the Q&A session, but before I do, I want to ask you, make a donation. We're going to put the link in the chat, environmentalvoter.org/donate-texas-2024. Your money will go towards our Texas efforts. All donations help. Obviously, big donations help even more, and there is no limit to the amount you can donate. If you want to donate if you want to donate all $2 million, maybe don't do it with your credit card. We don't want banks getting all of those processing fees. Maybe you can wire the money to us, but you can donate as much as you want. You can donate as little as you want. It all makes a difference. Second, monthly donations are enormously important. They're good for many of you because you can spread out your donations. You don't need to do it all at once. They're good for us because they help us with this planning. And remember, the key to us getting such amazing results is we don't just keep our powder dry and only talk to these people right when there's a big, sexy federal election going on. No, we've got all of these elections coming up in May and June, and even some more this month in April, I believe, where we can talk to these voters and increase their likelihood of voting this fall and beyond. But we can't do that if we don't have the money. This year-round work requires year-round funding. And then finally, do you want to host an online Zoom event like this? I'll go into more detail about our work at EVP, but I could also focus on Texas or some of our other states. If so, please reach out to us. You can let us know in the chat or in the Q&A, or you can email us at info@environmentalvoter.org, and we'll send you the information, and I'll hop on Zoom and walk through everything with you. So we're going to get to the Q&A, but right before we do, I do just want to reiterate, we have a little bit more than 7 months left before, I don't want to be melodramatic here, but we all know this is the most important election cycle of our lives. We know who our targets are. We know how to turn them from non-voters into voters. And you are here for a reason. You are here today watching this Zoom because you care deeply about the climate crisis, you care deeply about the democracy crisis, and you recognize the importance of this moment in time that we are all living in right now. So please take advantage of this opportunity. There is nothing I would like more than to start reporting back to you the impact that we are having on a daily basis in Texas and elsewhere with the money that you've invested in our work. So please make that donation, but also submit your questions in the Q&A. And I can't wait to answer them. So what do we got, Danielle?
We've got some great questions, and I want to start out by saying I apologize. My Zoom kicked me off for a brief moment there, and I had marked Annette's question as something I wanted to ask you. Annette, I know it was about the reliability of polling results. So if you are able to, please resend it. Nathaniel, maybe you can actually see it in the Q&A folder, but I'll give you a second to see if you can find that, and maybe
Yeah.
you're.
Yeah, I can see it. So how confident should we be regarding polling data? Some polling is becoming less reliable. Yeah, so Annette, certainly there have been some instances, not a lot, but some, of polling data being less reliable lately. I will say that actually, despite all the talk of a red wave in 2022, that obviously didn't come to fruition, the polls in 2022 were extraordinarily accurate, like shockingly accurate. Some of the most accurate of any national federal election going back to the 1980s. Like they were absurdly accurate. Uh, that being said, I'm not a pollster. I'm not here to defend them. But what I will say is when you see such consistent data, regardless of the type of election, whether it be local, state, or federal, regardless of the geographic location, and over and over and over again, it shows that almost no likely voters are listing climate as their top priority. I mean, we could ignore that, but I think it would be foolish to. And what I do know is that politicians pay attention to it. Politicians are absolutely paying attention to it. And so I think it's extraordinarily important for those of us in the climate movement to recognize this lack of political power. But even if, and I'm pretty confident in what I just said, but even if, Annette, because I understand where your skepticism is coming from in polling data these days, even if I'm wrong, worst case scenario is we build up the power of the climate movement. And boy, is that still something that we need. We sure as hell ain't getting the results in the political sphere that science demands. So there's no doubt that we don't have enough political power. Whether you think polls are accurately measuring that lack of political power, yeah, I think that's an interesting point to bring up, because uh, because even though recently polls have been spot on, 4 years ago, 6 years ago, there was certainly some issues, and so I think that's absolutely worth bringing up.
Right. Thank you, Nathaniel. And the next question that we have from Benjamin Murphy: what's the ratio of the control group to treatment group? Will you continue to keep a control group, or is your ultimate goal to reach every low propensity environmental voter?
Really, really great question. So, except in really, really small states, like say New Hampshire and Alaska, uh, we almost always have 85% of our targets in a treatment group and 15% of our targets in a control group. There's no magic number here. The simple truth is the more people you have in the control group, the easier it is to identify what's called a statistically significant result that can prove that you had an impact. But there's a downside to that, right? The more people you have in your control group, the fewer people you're talking to. And we want to talk to people. We want to get people to vote. And so, yes, certainly there is a tension there. What I will say, though, is we're not going to get rid of our control group this year. We're not, for a few reasons. One, it is enormously important to us to always be able to prove to our donors and volunteers that we are having an impact. Someone who has run dozens of political campaigns, the simple truth is volunteers are asked to do a lot of stuff that does not make a difference. And donors are asked to fund a lot of stuff that does not make a difference. And we don't want to be an organization like that. As things stand, we are able to tell our volunteers, whether they are canvassing, postcarding, or calling on the phone, that every single script we give them has been proven in a previous randomized control trial to increase turnout at a statistically significant rate. And boy, is it nice to be able to say that. The second reason is we want to keep learning. Just because a message worked really well 2 years ago doesn't mean it's going to work this year. And so we want to be able to test that, or doesn't mean it's going to work next year. And then finally, the third reason is, because believe me, I understand the crucial nature of this year's election. I told you we've got a $2 million budget in Texas. If you add up all of our 19 states, and in many of them we're not eager to spend a lot of money, we're looking to raise over $11.5 million. That's just for the people in our current treatment groups at a really, really robust level. That's a significant amount of money for us to raise. And so even with us setting aside a control group, we still have a whole lot of money to raise just to, with a really, really robust effort, reach the folks in our treatment group. So I don't think we're at a point yet where we are inefficiently spending money going after our treatment group, because you know what's special about that 11.5 million number? That's the number we came up with after looking at our previous randomized control trials and determining where we would start to see a decrease in ROI, where we would start to see a drop off in the number of votes we were creating per dollar spent. So we spend $11.5 million before we even start to see a point of diminishing returns. And so that is a very, very good question, but that's the third reason why, yeah, we're gonna stick to our treatment and controls for the time being.
Okay, our next question, and it kind of covers a question. I answered part B of Randall's question in the chat, but the first part of Randall's question and Carolyn also are asking about the messaging that we use. Carolyn specifically asking about our canvassing messaging, which I love talking about our canvassing program, so very exciting. Thanks for the good question. And then Carolyn's other question, or other parts of her question, are how do you keep people from slamming the doors in your faces? And yeah, just thinking about how, phone banking, sometimes people are quick to hang up the phone. So
yeah, great questions, Carolyn and Randall. So the first thing that I will say before I start answering your question is we've got a whole bunch of messaging experiments in the reports and studies tab of our website. Second, we have what's called a mini briefing. I think it's only like a 6 or 7 minute video on our YouTube page that goes through 3 specific successful messaging experiments. So I don't know if Danielle is going to be able to find the links to that, but if she is able to, she'll put those in the chat. Okay, I'll talk about the successful messaging that we use. First, I'm going to talk about it in sort of a broader theoretical sense, and then I'm going to narrow down to the specific use cases that you had mentioned, Caroline. So at a theoretical level, what we are not doing, and I know this sounds odd and counterintuitive, is we are not trying to rationally convince people of the importance of voting because they care about climate change. The simple truth is that doesn't work. Doesn't work. Generations of behavioral scientists, perhaps the most important of which, the most well-known of which, Danny Kahneman, just died 2 days ago, have run hundreds of experiments showing that human beings are social animals much more than we are rational animals. And if you want to change someone's behavior, usually the best way to do it is to message to them as though they are social animals. Okay, so what does that mean? It means usually what we are trying to do, whether you're trying to get someone to vote or lose weight or exercise more often or vaccinate their children, is figure out what social norms do they buy into and how can we leverage that to change their behavior. So for instance, do we think that most people want to be thought of as honest people who keep their promises? Well, maybe we'll send a canvasser to their door, ask them if they intend to vote. Most people will say yes. And then we can follow up with them right before the election and say, hey, Carolyn, I just want to remind you that, back in April, you said that you were going to vote, and Tuesday's your opportunity to follow through on that promise. And we know it's important to you to follow through on your promises. Believe me, equating the act of voting with whether you're an honest person who keeps her promises is a lot more powerful than me just saying, hey, you've really got to vote because, you care about climate change. And randomized control trials have shown that. And you asked about canvassing. That's what our canvassers do. They really just go to the door. They're not trying to twist anybody's arm. These are people who already care deeply about climate and the environment. And you're just asking them, oh, we've got an election coming up. Do you intend to vote on election day or vote early or vote by mail? And that's it. That's it. But what that does is it gets people in the mindset of thinking about how they're going to vote. And two, it allows a phone banker a few months later to call that person up and remind them that they said they were going to vote. And that's also, to get to the second part of your question, how we keep a lot of doors being slammed in our canvassers' faces. We are not making a lot of the hard ass that canvassers normally make. We're not trying to convince someone to vote for a candidate they don't want to vote for. We're not trying to convince someone to care about an issue that they don't care about. No, we're just taking advantage of another social norm, which is that even awful voters want to be thought of as good voters. And so if you ask them if they intend to vote, most people will say yes. That's just one example. We also use basic things like peer pressure. So we'll send people letters saying, oh, did you know last time there was an election, 100 people on your block of Main Street turned out to vote? Or we'll send digital ads to people that takes advantage of another behavioral science concept called trending norms, where we say, oh my gosh, more and more people in Texas are voting each year. In fact, look at this bar chart. Oh my gosh, don't be left behind. Like you're going to be the last person in Texas left who's not voting. And we try to leverage this FOMO, this fear of missing out. Fancy pants academics call it trending norms, but the idea is still the same. The idea is that there is this norm that our targets want to fit into, and we leverage that to change their behavior. We're getting towards the end of our time, but I do want to let you know that we publish a whole bunch of these messaging experiments on our website, and I would encourage you to go and check them out. We also are going to be doing another webinar. I believe it's at somewhere near the end of this month. Danielle, you might be able to find it and put a link in the chat. But it's another webinar just on successful messaging experiments that we've done. And it's later on in April. It's not a fundraiser. I encourage you to show up and learn about our really recent successful messaging results. All right, we've gone 1 minute over time. And so if you have more questions, please send them to us at info@environmentalvoter.org. We really, really do want to answer them for you. We really, really do. But I will just close with this. We've got 7 months and 3 days until an election that all of us are worried about. And again, I want to reiterate that you are here for a reason. You're here because you recognize the importance of this moment in time. You are here because you care deeply about the climate crisis. You are here because you care deeply about the democracy crisis, and you care deeply about building our movement's political power. So take advantage of this opportunity. There is a donation link in the chat. Please click on it so that it's open when the Zoom ends, and make a generous donation. We have individually identified these 710,000 super environmentalists who are unlikely to vote, and we've run hundreds of randomized control trials showing us what messages work best to turn them from non-voters into new voters. We just need the donors to make it happen, and we just need the volunteers to make it happen. So please do it now, and do a favor for that future version of yourself who 7 months from now is going to be sitting on the couch watching election returns roll in. And I promise you're not going to want to have any regrets. So please, please join us. As I said before, nothing would give me more pleasure than to be able to start reporting back to you on all of the great results that we're having with your funding. So thank you, Danielle. Thank you to all of you. Gosh, what a great crowd this is. Thank you to all of you who joined us today. And I hope to see you on some of our future webinars or on the doors in Austin, right, Danielle?
That's right. Yes, please reach out if you're interested in canvassing. And can we give Nathaniel a shout out for your pronunciation of Amarilla? That was,
Was
yeah.
that good?
Oh, I caught that.
All right. Well, thank you, Danielle. Thank you. My family members up in Stinnett, Texas, which is close by, will be happy about that. All right. Have a good night, folks.